I don't think the U.S.-Russia relationship has changed very much at all in the last 6 months to a year. I mean, it's certainly true that when Putin and Trump met in Helsinki for their first summit, the media went absolutely crazy, especially because of the long conversation that they had absent anyone but the translators, highly irregular, and because of the nature of some of Trump's statements in the press meeting that they had afterwards, which seemed to be far more solicitous of Russia than anyone else, certainly in the administration, would be. But it didn't lead to anything. Didn't lead to any concrete policy. Nothing came out of it. In fact, most recently, the United States, Trump announced that the United States will be leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, the INF, which many American presidents have believed that the Russians have not been actually living up to their part of the bargain on. We have additional sanctions that are on Russia and more that are probably coming down because of the investigations into Russian cyber attacks and information attacks on the United States, which have not been as significant in the run-up to the midterm elections, but they are certainly still intervening to some degree in information warfare. So you, on the one hand, had a president who has been seen as having authoritarian impulses, wanting to be buddy-buddy with Putin more than anyone else. And, is this the basis of the collusion that he denies, but the Mueller investigation is looking into? On the other hand, the reality of U.S.-Russia relations under the Trump administration is that it's about as broken as it has been under the Obama administration. There's very little prospect of that changing anytime soon. And even though Putin seems to avoid criticizing Trump personally, the level of ire that comes from Russia, even most recently announcing that they want to pursue a path of de-dollarization of their economy, is actually, pretty significant in showing that these countries are not becoming friendly anytime soon. I don't like the fact that we are considering pulling yet another plank out of an already shakier architecture of international agreements. When the U.S. pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord or pulls out of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, or now says they're going to pull out of the INF deal, I mean, those are all agreements that are imperfect. INF wasn't preventing nuclear proliferation. We still had a hell of a lot of nuclear weapons. There's still a potential of World War III through an escalation, inadvertent or advertent. But it's better than not having it. So if you get rid of it, it becomes a little shaky and you lose some of your resilience to deal with international crises as they come about. But we also need to understand that the dangers of the world order over the next 10, 20, 30 years are probably not going to be the same ones that we have been so concerned about during the time of the Cold War. So is it nuclear annihilation, or is it cyber attack that would destroy an economy? Certainly until the Mueller investigation is over, and I think as long as Trump is president, the ability of the Americans and Russians to work together is going to be massively constrained. I think that there is an absolute ceiling on how good relations could get in that environment. It's a fairly low ceiling. I think that in the future, both different leadership in the U.S., certainly the potential for different leadership in Russia, but also the reality of the geopolitical environment. If you look at what's happening in China, if we end up with what looks like an emerging Cold War in technology between the United States and China, it's not necessarily clear that Russia's on the Chinese side of that. They might be. Right now, if they were forced to decide, they might be. But in 5 years, in 10 years' time, depending on how big China is at that point and how threatening they are to Russia and countries right on Russian borders, I think that could easily change. So this idea that Kissinger has had for a while, that the Americans and Russians in a multipolar world should be natural allies, is something that I'm not quite as strong in that view as the former Secretary of State, but there's absolutely a logic there that deserves to be explored. It cannot be explored right now. The American media in particular has zero understanding and zero interest in the fact that the Americans are responsible for a number of the significant problems in the U.S.-Russia relationship. And I'm not even talking about the absence of a Marshall Plan. I'm talking about like Ukraine, where we easily could have brought Ukraine as into the West. They were begging for loans. They were begging for support. And we didn't care. We said it's Europe's problem. And the Germans said, well, we're bailing out Greece and Cyprus. We're sure as hell not going to bail out corrupt Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government has no choice but to go to Sochi for the Olympics and beg Putin for a big bailout. And they get it. And the conditionality is to orient not towards Europe, but towards the Eurasian Union, which they were forced into because the Americans and Europeans didn't care.